All right, so as you work with them, you can check through all the resources. If there's certain things in there that you like, that you may want to use in the future, don't be afraid to create a separate folder with them, move textures into there, identify what the textures are. You're going to find as we start working a bit more, or as you even start working a bit more inside of Photoshop and using the tools that are available to us, that these simple textures and that we've used have a bunch of different uses to them. So don't be afraid to start to build and put in there. And we'll talk a little bit even about assembling what it is are the tools that you tend to use the most often, even getting a little bit into the workspaces that we have inside of here. So the main thing we're going to do is we're going to really kind of get back into Photoshop. Some of you may not have been in Photoshop for a while. Some of you may have been in it more recently. So we're going to get in here. We're going to open up and see what's available to us inside of here. So as we start up our Photoshop for maybe the first time in a while, I'm just going to go ahead and click on Create New. I'm not going to worry about too much here. I'm just going to go to Print. I'm going to make it letter size and say Create, so that way it goes ahead and just simply pulls me up my workspace so I can see what it is that I have in here that's available to me. As we go and we start to navigate the workspace, how you decide to move about it is really up to you. How you choose to set everything up inside of here really is up to you. So as we start to think about our panels, now that we're getting beyond the basics at this point, while we're working in an educational setting, I always encourage you not to move a bunch of stuff around. But in this class, if you find there's certain tools, certain panels that you use all the time, this would be the time to go ahead and create yourself a new workspace. And then once you create that new workspace, that you go ahead and save that workspace for you. So as you start to think about what's there, what are you using, do you like what's here, do you like the way that they're set up, do you want to change them? In the upper right hand corner, you're going to find a little drop down arrow, and this is around, it shows a little box next to it. This is where we have our workspaces set up in here. Unlike the other applications and some of the previous versions of applications that allow you to have it across the top for the workspace, this is going to be over there on that upper right hand corner. Here we go, and we start to look at what's inside of here. We have our essentials. It's the one that you're typically using. So if you click on essentials, nothing should change. If you go ahead and move down, look at 3D, it's going to give us different items. What is it that we're trying to do in here? What are we working with? If you go in and change everything around, down here it allows you to do new workspace. If you are using certain tools all the time, build yourself a workspace. It's like when we talk about actions. If you're doing something over and over and over again, record an action just to speed it up for you. So at that point, you can put those things wherever you want to, and then you can simply come in here and they should show up. Let's go ahead and we'll save one. So we'll call this one Yada. And we'll say save. So now if we come back up there and look, you'll see there it is. It's at the top, the divider bar at the top. Previous versions, older versions, if you get into the CSs, so if you're running on really old stuff, they still work. But if you're running on like CS6, it should be put in the new workspaces below, at the very bottom, below the dividing line. On the newer ones, they place it at the top. That divider just tells you that everything above that is a user defined. So in this case, if you're working in Essentials and you decide you got to go into the stuff that you want, if you go ahead and just select that, it'll pop them into their location. If you get on there and somebody else has one that they're using, don't delete their stuff. But create yourself a new one. So I'm going to jump back over here to Essentials. On any of these, if something gets moved, you can click on Reset and it will put it back. Remember, as we're working in here, that reset function is going to move them to where you initially saved it. That's because as we move them inside of it, even on your own one, if you move panels around a little bit, it's going to stay that way until you come back to it. So think about what are you using for your workspace? What are the panels? What do you like about them? What don't you like about them? All of your panels, again, this is just a bit of a refresher, allows us to go in and decide what is it that we're seeing inside of there. So these are all panel options. So I'm on the color panel option. It allows me to go in and decide what exactly am I working with. So we have our hue cube, brightness cube, color wheel, grayscale sliders, RGB sliders, HSB, hue, saturation, and brilliance. CMYK, lab sliders, web color sliders, and that's just what exactly are we seeing out here for it. You may not have used a whole lot of these in some of the other ones, but we get into patterns. What are we looking at thumbnail-wise? Don't forget about these options. It's easy when we're not in here, not using them regularly, to find ourselves forgetting what's available to us. We get into our properties. In this case, we can close just one tab or close the tab group. Adjustments. What are we seeing for adjustments? So going in and selecting inside of here. We don't spend a whole lot of time inside of these panel groups, especially early on. The more you work with it, again, once we get back to those certain panels that you find yourself using over and over again, you may find yourself inside of those panel options. So if you're looking for something, you can't find something, you know it exists inside of there, or if you're looking at other resources, since as we get deeper and deeper into any application, we start to push to do new things. I don't know everything, you don't know everything, we'll never know everything. So with that, as it goes through and starts to tell us different steps. I know people who make way more money than I do doing design work, and they still use YouTube and everything else to learn something from somebody else. So with that, those may be in there. Just know that that's where those different options are at. So don't forget about these panel menus as well. As you go through and start to work with it, what are your tools? So on the far left, we start thinking about the tools that are available to us. What do you use? What are your favorite ones inside of here? If you get really good and you can read everything and you're fine with reading it, that's great. If we have to go in, you want to see names, we can go in and start looking at the names of stuff, rollovers. Create cheat sheets. I mean, if you're struggling with certain things, there's nothing against creating a little sheet, sticking it attached right to the side of your computer monitor so you can go through and reference what is there. Refamiliarize yourself with what's underneath of our different file menus. So what does it allow us to do when we start dealing with Photoshop, starting to think about what are we doing to save something. If we're saving it as, then what happens when we go into our save as? What are the options available to us? So as we come in here, we start to look at the formats. What are these formats? What happens with the various formats? And we'll talk a little bit about advantages to each one of these. So those save as, if you start to look through them, you should recognize something about save as. What do the save as allow us to do? Most of the stuff is going to be in here when we start looking at the saves or save as. In the applications, it's saving something that's a similar type of file. So in Photoshop, if it's image-based, most of your save as should be all image-based. If you're in Illustrator, the same thing. If you do a save as, typically going to show you scalable vector graphics, PDFs, things that remain a vector. So save as tends to be the same format. Exports will allow you to go in and start to export something else out of here. So in this case, export as, and then it's going to allow us to come up and choose what exactly are we going to. There's nothing in here, but what are we going to export it as? And this is where typically you're going to get into something else, and this is where you'd find there's that SVG for a scalable vector graphic. Keep that in mind as you're working, as you're starting to create stuff, as you're starting to create content. Because at this point, now we're getting to the area where we're going to be creating content, not just to hit print and have it come off the nice printer over there. Now we're going to start talking about where is this going to, what are they going to use it for, starting to develop different content. We get into the whole thing thinking again about digital-wise, where is this going to go to? Moving through on our layers and that, keeping track of where the different items are at inside of here, committing more of your shortcut keys, making your selections. Now we're going to really start pushing the whole idea of creating these composites and focusing on what is available to us. What do we have in here for our selections? So we have the select and mask, which allows us to go through and refine what is here. Selections based on color area. Up to this point, you've probably been working mainly with the marquee tools. And we start talking about marquees and doing the selection tools. How many shapes do we have for a marquee? 2. So we have rectangle, we have ellipse. And that's what this is about today, is just kind of getting our mind back into it. So we start talking about marquees. Those are the two that we have. We go and we start looking at our selection tools then as we start thinking about using our lasso, our magnetic lassos, our polygonal lassos. What can we do with those? How can we work with those to make the selections better? As we start talking about replacing things. We're going to start getting into the point where, depending on what you're working on, we may be selecting things based on a color range even. So we want to isolate into this color, or we're adding multiple colors to create that selection. Maybe we're selecting it to change something. So continue to think about what is it that we're using in here and where are these things. Filters. Now, what's the big thing we use filters for? What do we use them for? Images. We're going in here, we're going to use these to make some changes, right? So we start thinking about creating stuff in here. What can we do with these filters? There are probably filters you've never used. So what I would urge you to do is to get into here, though, and play a little bit with some of the other filters. We're going to get into looking at what else can we do with them, going in and dealing with like sharpening things. And we're going to start to use these setups to go in and remove motion blur. So we start taking pictures of stuff and everything starts running together. Well, we're going to go in and start looking at ways we can utilize this to remove some motion that already exists inside of what it is that we're shooting. So we're going to use some of these things the way that you would expect them to be used. We're also going to look at how we can utilize some of these in a way to do something that maybe you haven't thought about using it for. But I do encourage you to get in, even just grabbing a couple images and playing around to see what happens with each one of the filters. Does that mean you're going to remember exactly what it did? No. But maybe at some point you can sit down and you're like, wow, I wish I could do, wait a minute. When I was playing around with it, I remember I did something with that, and you just jump back into it. So you can go through and we can start looking at what we have inside of here based upon our 3Ds. Blurs, what are we doing with our blurs? We have sharpens. Stylize, what's going to happen with that? And remember, as we start to work with these, though, we're not necessarily going to use a filter and keeping that finished effect. We can use that filter on something, and then by utilizing a blend mode, give us a whole different look with it. So we're going to push, we're going to start talking and really working in those, like I said, blend modes are going to become important. Using the different adjustment layers is going to become important. Starting to look at lighting effects, but then how can we apply a lighting effect, and then via those blend modes and adjustment layers, how can we then go ahead and take that lighting effect that's applied to one image and allow it to mesh into the other image. So don't be afraid to go in. Are we going to get into video? No, we're not going to get into video. But some of these other things we can start getting into as we start looking at the ability of using like high passes and offsets to go in and create, again, additional items that we can use inside of what is there. There's the filter gallery. You can go in and see kind of what's happening inside with that 3D. Don't be afraid to work a little bit with 3D if you need to. You can always go in and create something in 3D, and if you want just the image, the look of it, so you don't want to continue to work in that 3D panel. Most of you you've all used 3D in Photoshop. Yeah, we used it a little bit in 184, not much. And then some of the people who may have had 189 a couple years ago, we used Photoshop at 1.2 in there for doing basic 3D stuff. So we can create 3D content, and then once we're done with that 3D content, we can take that image and essentially form it into an image if you want to bring that in, so you're not dealing again with the 3D content in the 3D panel to adjust that text. You just have a flat image. You can extract, of course, take that graphic and just use it inside of a design. So don't be afraid to go in and utilize what's available inside of there. As we start getting into our views, again, just recommit all of this stuff back. We start thinking about colors, what's there. Most of the stuff inside of here is going to be uploaded electronically. So as we start looking at it from an electronic standpoint, still maintain those minimum specs. So we start looking at most of the stuff that you're going to have at 150 pixels per inch. So making sure that's there, that they show up the way they're supposed to. But continue to work with this. If you start looking at how you're seeing stuff on the screen, you can adjust that. There isn't anything in here that really I'm going to stress that you have to use. It's, again, preference. Plugins. Now, depending on what you have for plugins, you can go in and see those. There are places to download plugins, purchase plugins. It just depends on what it is that you're doing. At one point when I was doing a bunch of wedding photography, I had some plugins. There were some from Nikon. I had an app called Portraiture. It was all designed to go in and allow me to quickly edit skin tones and things like that, smooth out the photos. So if you have additional plugins, certainly you can access those. As you start to work and start to do certain things, you may find that there's plugins that are going to make your work more efficient. Don't be afraid to use them. Sometimes there's some out there that are actually really cheap. There's free ones, and then there's ones that are really expensive. So we're not going to work with any specific plugins inside of here, but that is a possibility to it. And then lastly, of course, as we start to work with the windows that are in here, maintaining what's available to us. At some point, you're going to be looking for a window and go, why can I not find the window? And you'll come over here, it's going to have a check mark next to it, and you're like, well, it's obviously open somewhere on my screen. So with that, the other thing you can do is you can toggle that on and off. If we go in here and we start looking at the workspace itself, if you're working on something that has multiple variations to it, don't forget about the ability to go in and adjust how the tabs are actually on there. The one that, if you get into 4, you go to that 4 up, it kind of takes you into that basic, what I would consider dealing with like an orthographic drawing. So with that, something like that setup, a lot of times my tabs are all just stacked and I move from one to the next, but it's when you start wanting to drag stuff from image to image that you can go through, and it's nice to have them set up a little differently. So don't be afraid to go in and change these. The workspaces, here's another ability to access the workspaces. There are the ability to go in and adjust keyboards and shortcuts. Don't go in and change them on a shared computer. Plus, I always say not to change them, mainly because as you move maybe machine to machine, if you're working on your home computer and you go into a work computer, if you keep changing around shortcuts on each of those, it just makes it a little harder for you to remember them. Plus, if you need help from somebody and they come over and you've changed all the shortcut keys and they don't know what they are, then it takes time to hunt around and find what is there. Your own personal machine, change them all you want. Then we can go ahead and lock the workspace so we can't do anything to it. If you lose anything at the top of your screen, so application frame, options, or tools, this is where you find them. May seem crazy saying that, especially in a second course, but trust me, I have people who use Photoshop somewhat regularly who have reached out to me saying, this isn't showing up and I can't figure out why. And I direct them simply over here to the window and say, are these checked? Oh, nope. And then you'll get that back. Because see, if I uncheck my tools and I open up Photoshop and I go, where are my tools? Why aren't my tools not there? Now, in the past, if you go over here and reset it, it doesn't bring your tools back, but it does now. So that would be a quick way to get them back. In the past, you haven't been able to bring those items in. They'll be disappeared because they're a separate subset. Yeah, it used to be set. They're like, I've reset stuff and it won't come back, and I've restarted the application and they haven't been able to find them. So if you reset them now, the tool panel is going to pop back up there. But those are in their own little subset there. Like I said, I've had many people who have lost them and come to me. And I'll be honest, the first time that somebody asked me about it a long time ago, I had to go figure out where it was you could turn them off. And then finally, that's what I directed them back to. So you have that ability to go in there and adjust those. And then probably the best thing that they've added into Photoshop is this, I don't know if it's still stripped HTML5. It used to be HTML5 when they first made the change to it. It is an active search bar, so when you type it in, it will highlight as you hover over the stuff. It'll highlight in the menus where it's at. So if you type in there, you're going to start to see stuff show up. So tools, preferences, well, that's how we get to them. Preferences, tools, toolbar, analysis ruler, analysis count tool, tool presets, tools. So you'll see it allows us to go through and find those. What's great about it is if you go ahead and you click on tools inside the help, it's going to go ahead and act just like you clicked on it inside of the menu. Very powerful tool. Now, as you go through, start to work on your keyboard shortcuts. Try to commit as many of these to memory as possible. They were nice enough on page 9 to create a little cheat sheet for you. So you can look at what happens to bring up your brush window, your colors, your layers. The other nice thing on this, I don't know how I have this one set up here. Let's see. So with that, you'll see if you want layers on and off. And this is something you can start to use if you find yourself on a smaller screen especially. Maybe you want layers on, but then when you're doing the work out on the screen, you want to use that real estate for being able to see what it is you're working on. That allows you to toggle those on and off. Now the machines inside here in the classroom, right now the function keys are actually all set up to run the controls that are up there. So you'll see volume up, volume down. To use those as F keys. On the middle section of keys, you're going to see the FN key. That is the function key. If you hold down that function key, so it's directly under what they have listed as F13, you'll see an FN key. If you hold that down, then the function keys will all run as the F keys. And that's just the way all of these should be set up, and that's the default setup on them as well. So you can go in, you can work with that to go ahead and select those different items. So start to think about how you can use these. Again, this is all about becoming more efficient inside of Photoshop. So start to use the shortcuts. And these are all about the ones that you use regularly. And you'll probably find the more that you use them, the more you're going to go in there and work with it. Now the big thing when we get inside of Photoshop, or as we begin to work with it, especially now, is what is it that we are going to be using? What are the file formats available to us? Now the great thing about Photoshop is it works with a ton of different file formats. So just about anything that would be a standard file format out there, you're going to be able to get inside of here. So when we start looking at JPEGs versus RAW versus a Photoshop document, if we talk about the PSB files, which are the same as a PSD file, but we start looking at size, and that becomes an important situation. And then we go and we start working with TIFFs. So out of them, those are the main ones. And then we'll talk a little bit about RAW. So we get into the file format. Now JPEG, what's great about JPEGs is they are nice small files. The other thing that's nice about JPEG is we can view it on any machine. The issue that we kind of have when we start getting into JPEGs is they're ultimately a compressed file. So every time that you save that JPEG, it's going to ultimately lose just a little bit of detail, where theoretically we could resave a JPEG image a number of times. What that number is, I couldn't tell you. And eventually it would just keep degrading down until it becomes pretty much nothing. So when we start to think about that, what's there? The other thing in JPEGs is we can't keep layers. So as you start to save something or export something out, what is the purpose of that? What are you doing with that image? Where is it going? What flexibility do you want to have with it? The JPEG is going to give you, really, it's going to destroy just about all your flexibility, because once it goes in there, it just mashes it down. We go through, we work with raw images. Have either of you worked with raw images? No? Yeah. So when we start looking at raw images, the nice thing about raw images is it contains way more information available to you. Anything, essentially, I talk about it's like a WYSIWYG format. So what you see is what you get. And it's going to go and it's going to capture everything. The big thing with that is it gives you a ton of flexibility. So you can go and do everything. White balance, color temperatures, color shifts, all of that's available to you inside of there. There's absolutely no compression with it. So if we think about it from the standpoint that there's no compression, you can work in there, it's non-destructive, because even when we go through and we work with a raw image, once we save that raw image, there's essentially a separate file that comes off of it that gets created as well that has all the settings kind of embedded into it. Yes, it reads back into that file. The thing is, they give you really, really nice images. The downfall with those is that they're huge. I mean, they're absolutely enormous files. For example, my Canon, which will be the CRW is what it shoots for a RAW. It actually goes through, so my basic images are right around between 4 and 6 megs is a normal large JPEG. All of mine that I shoot with RAW then are like 32 to 40 megs. So we start looking at a size increment. They're much larger file. Depending on what you're working with for a system. Now in Photoshop, we're not going to have an issue with that. It's going to allow us to bring them straight into there. Not all your cameras are going to shoot in RAW. Up to this point, even the RAW format isn't consistent. When we talk about it for file format, isn't consistent across the board. There's some that shoot, like I said, there's CRWs, there's, I think Nikon's is NEF. But the one that's starting to come around a little bit is the DNG file. So when we start looking at a DNG, I always refer to that, just think of it like digital negative. So when we go through and have that, that becomes more of a common format. And the last time that I worked with DNG or saving, a CRW or CR2 or NEF, any of those as a DNG, the file was even larger. What's that?
Is that the iPhone RAW version or mobile phone version?
The iPhone, I don't know what I don't think you can set anything to the RAW. I don't know what the highest setting is on an iPhone for camera. Image wise, I mean, most of the stuff that's all going to be shot, they're going to be JPEG based. But I'm not sure if there are additional settings you can get into for it. I mean, that's a new one. I've never even thought about going in and seeing what else it can run with. Let's see. Formats, high efficiency, Apple Pro RAW.
Oh, so you have it, I don't. I have the 11 Pro, so you have the 13.
Yes.
Yep. I don't have that.
So this is the 12.
Yeah.
This is the 12.
One after.
Yeah, this is the 12. So you can go in PhotoCapture, you can go into Apple Pro RAW. So it's a 12-bit file. It uses the linear DNG format. Each file is approximately 25 megabytes. So yeah, if you have the newer phones that will have that, Apple's built in now the capability of doing Photo RAW to go in and edit what is in there. Now I don't know what the actual settings are. Let's do this for fun. You go ahead and capture an image of just this. And let's look at the info. So, not sure, no, it's still, so this still showed up as a JPEG. Oh, there we go. Let's turn RAW on. Let's shoot a picture of it. And then let's go in and so on it, so when you shoot on so this is the iPhone 12 Pro shot in RAW, it gives you everything. So this shot with an ISO of 80, 26 millimeter focal length, 0 on the adjustment for exposure, f1.6 at 1/60th of a second. It's a 3024 pixel by 4032 pixel image at 25.9 megs, which equals out to 12 megapixels. So if you have the new phone, you can do that, and you do have the option across the top then to turn RAW on or off. But again, you're looking at a much, much larger file size. So you do have that ability inside of there if you turn that on. I turned mine back off, but so if you turn that on, you'll have access in there to shoot in the RAW, which, like I said, works off then as a DNG essential file. PSD files, again, specific to Photoshop, they're going to open up inside of there. Remember, you can do layers inside of there. You can have multiple layers. You can save it out as a single file. The other nice thing about working inside of Photoshop is the ability to move it into other Adobe applications. So that even goes into if you start to think about creating if we go in, we work with the stuff, and we want to bring it in because we're dealing with digital sign. We can just bring that straight into, say, After Effects as we go in to create motion inside of there. Also allows us, of course, to keep those layers in there as we bring it over into somewhere else and animate those individual layers. The downfall, of course, is it's large. It might take a little bit longer to save. The other thing is you can't really view it anywhere other than in Photoshop. And then, as all Adobe applications, I wish they would change how this runs, as you can't open a PSD that's saved in 2021 version on a machine that's only 2020. So as you work, especially if you work in here, doesn't allow you to go back and do that. There used to be on some of these, when you did save as, would actually allow you to go into they consider a legacy format. Bless you. But on these, we can't do that. And Photoshop's been one that typically hasn't allowed you to go back and do that. So just keep in mind as you're working on it that depending on what you have, you may not be able to open it. Now, how can we get around that a little bit? It's possible to work with a TIFF file. So if you work with a TIFF file in here, you export it out as a TIFF file, you maintain layers, and you reopen that TIFF in an older version. That sometimes will work. So if you find yourself working on various computers, keep that in mind. You may have to work a little bit differently than what you're used to. TIFF files, like I said, they are large. There are many times where we start getting into a TIFF file. I've had TIFF files that have ended up larger than my Photoshop document, just because of the way it goes through and was coding and stuff. But typically they're just a little bit smaller, but they are still large files. You know what TIFF stands for? Tagged image file format is kind of where that comes from. So we go through and we start to think about how we work. The big thing is figure out how you want to organize your space. That's something that maybe up till now you haven't really sat down and thought about. But how are you going to organize stuff? What are the tools that you use? What is the workspace that you have available? On the machines in here, you have the ability to use that secondary monitor. So moving panels over onto it, keeping the focus of edit on your main screen. You may decide you want all of your panels to stay on your main screen. That's completely up to you, how you want to go in and work with that. The other thing that's possible inside of here is if you have dual displays, you may not be using a display right now, but you can create a second view of the current file you're working on. So on the right-hand monitor could be the actual finished project. So when you're zoomed in, doing edits and stuff on the main display, after you do an edit, you can look over to the right and you'll be able to see exactly what it looks like over on that monitor as well. So you can see that the 10,000 foot view while you're working on the 3-inch view. Start to think about what your workflow is going to be. How are you going to work with stuff? What are your steps that you're going to go through? We talk in a lot of other applications that you have specific steps. Sometimes they're very linear in nature. Sometimes they allow you to bounce around through it. What is going to be your workflow? How are you going to start with stuff? What are you going to bring in? Are you going to bring all the layers in and then start to work with them? Are you going to work layer by layer and then import the next layer when you get to it? There isn't a right way, there isn't a wrong way. But if you go in and you start to find that as you work, that you've always followed that same workflow, you'll get a lot more efficient. You'll find that you're not burning up time searching for stuff, trying to do something different, moving around from here to there as you start to go into it. So starting to work those out based on sketches, acquiring images, getting them in. So for me, I sketch out my ideas. Once I have my ideas sketched out, I refine those ideas. I then go in and a lot of times before I do my final sketch, I'll go in and I'll start looking at images, go into stock, pull images, pull a bunch of images that go in there that I identify as being images that'll work for what I'm doing. And then I'll go in and do that final sketch with the images that I've seen in mind so that I can start to think about scale, proportions, locations, and look at that composition of it, colors. And then after I have that, then I jump into the computer and I'll bring the files in that I'm ultimately going to work with. So if that's the method you want to work with, you can. If not, develop whatever it is that you want to have with it. The best part though is get back into here. Start using the tools, start building the stuff up, start putting things where you want it, and create an environment that actually is going to allow you to work and function exactly the way that you want to and make you more efficient.